Before the eyes of the entire court, a proud prince orders a lowly maid to mount the most feared stallion in the kingdom, a punishment meant to shatter her dignity. The animal is fire and fury, hooves striking, eyes blazing, every muscle a promise of disaster. But as the crowd holds its breath, what begins as a cruel spectacle turns into an impossible defiance, and a silent battle where one heart learns to match the rhythm of another. The midday sun glared down upon the courtyard, its heat seeping into the pale limestone walls and glinting from the polished buckles and buttons of the assembled nobility. The air shimmered faintly above the cobblestones, heavy with the mingled scents of horseflesh, oiled leather, and the sweet tang of orange blossoms drifting from the gardens beyond the arcade. At the far end, the stables formed a neat, low row of whitewashed walls and dark wooden doors, their shadows deep and cool. The rhythmic thud of hooves rang out, followed by the sudden sharp exhale of an animal's breath. Prince Alejandro sat astride the great black stallion with a posture that was almost careless in its grace, the way a swordsman holds a blade so well balanced it feels like an extension of his own body. Relampago's coat gleamed like a river of ink under sunlight, every movement of muscle beneath it betraying his barely contained strength. The prince guided him through a series of tight circles, making the animal wheel and halt, with the smallest pressure of knee and hand. Nobles in their silk coats and powdered wigs murmured in admiration. Fans fluttered lazily among jeweled fingers, and the servants, watching from the shadows, dared not speak at all. Lucia moved among them with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to being unnoticed. The weight of the silver tray pressed into her palm, its cargo of goblets gleaming. She kept her gaze low, her footsteps measured to avoid the hems of ladies' gowns or the boots of the courtiers who stood in casual clusters, as though they had nothing to do but witness the prince's latest display of mastery. Her cap sat firmly on her head, the white linen framing her face, though the heat prickled along her neck. She approached a group of visiting dignitaries, men in dark coats trimmed with gold braid, their voices thick with foreign accents, and stooped slightly as she offered the tray. But as she extended it, the foot of her shoe caught in a loose seam between stones. The tray tilted. A single goblet slid, as though in slow motion, spilling a dark, glistening stream of wine. It struck the polished leather boot of a marquis, a man whose reputation for vanity was exceeded only by his appetite for gossip. A sharp intake of breath came from the surrounding ladies. The marquis drew back his foot with a look of affront, as though she had scolded him. Murmurs rose like a breeze stirring the courtyard. Lucia felt her heart pound, not from fear, but from the knowledge of what such a mistake meant here, before these eyes. From his seat upon Relampago, Alejandro had seen it all. The curve of his mouth shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but contained its own cutting amusement. He turned the stallion with a flick of the reins, bringing the animal to a halt so sudden that dust puffed up beneath its hooves. "An accident, Your Highness," murmured one of the courtiers in a voice pitched low enough for propriety, but Alejandro raised his own voice to carry across the courtyard. "Clumsiness," he said lightly, "ought to be corrected where it occurs, so that the lesson is well remembered." His dark gaze locked on Lucia, lingering as though measuring her. Perhaps the palace will forgive a maid her error, if she proves herself capable of handling something far less forgiving. A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Some leaned forward, others smiled behind their fans. The prince's glance drifted toward the stables, and with an almost imperceptible signal, he summoned the stable hands. "Bring her Relampago," he ordered. The effect was immediate. One of the older grooms, his hair silvered with age, shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Your Highness," he began, but Alejandro's raised hand silenced him. The stable doors opened, and Relampago was led forward, the light catching the sheen of sweat along his powerful neck. The stallion's ears flicked back, and his front hooves struck the ground with a ringing blow. His restlessness radiated through the leather straps and polished bit, making the groom struggle to keep him steady. Lucia's pulse beat in her throat, but she stood still, tray at her side now, the weight of it pressing her fingers. The murmurs thickened, and though she kept her gaze from the assembled nobles, she felt their eyes on her as though they were a physical touch. She thought of the Marquis's disdainful glance, the sharp bite of embarrassment, and then of the prince, watching her with that unfathomable expression. One of the grooms tightened the girth on the saddle, and the stallion stamped in protest. Alejandro dismounted with a fluid motion, landing lightly beside the horse. His hand rested briefly on Relampago's shoulder before he gestured toward Lucia. "Mount," he said. The command hung in the air, clear and inescapable. The grooms shifted uneasily, and even some of the nobles whispered that the animal would throw her in a heartbeat. Alejandro's gaze never wavered. Lucia set down the tray upon a bench, her fingers tingling as they left the cool silver. She took a single step forward, feeling the dry grit of dust shift beneath her soles. The stallion's dark eyes rolled toward her, his breath flaring hot and sharp into the space between them. She could smell the mingled scents of leather and the musk of the animal, feel the vibration of his power in the ground. One of the grooms moved to steady the reins, but Relampago tossed his head violently, forcing the man to retreat a step. The stallion sidestepped, his flanks gleaming, every muscle tensed to explode into movement. The crowd had fallen nearly silent now. A woman's fan clicked shut. A man cleared his throat in anticipation. Lucia approached until she could reach the stirrup. The leather was warm from the sun, the iron cold under her fingers. She set her left foot upon it, her weight shifting upward. The stallion's skin twitched beneath the saddle's edge, and a low, restless sound rumbled in his chest. And then, without warning, Relampago reared high, hooves lashing the air in a burst of raw, untamed fury. The stallion's sudden rise split the air with the violent clatter of iron-shod hooves. Gasps broke from the crowd. A woman's cry rang sharp against the courtyard's stone walls. Lucia's pulse jolted, her body instinctively leaning into the danger instead of away from it. The smell of sweat and leather filled her senses, hot and bracing, as Relampago's shadow loomed high over her. "Hold him!" one of the grooms shouted, lunging forward. But the stallion struck down with a force that made the cobblestones shudder, his nostrils flaring in a white plume of breath. His tail lashed like a whip, scattering dust in the air. Lucia steadied herself, her hand closing firmly over the pommel. She could feel the grain of the worn leather beneath her fingers, the solid weight of the saddle. If she stepped back now, she would be finished. Her shame would be sealed in the eyes of every person gathered. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Prince Alejandro. He leaned one shoulder against a marble column, arms folded, his expression unreadable except for the faint glint in his eyes, as if he were testing not only the horse but her. The stablemaster cursed softly under his breath and caught hold of Relampago's bridle, drawing the animal's head toward him. "He'll kill her," he muttered. Alejandro's voice came smooth and quiet, but carrying across the courtyard. "Or she'll ride him." A murmur rippled through the watching nobles. Some exchanged wagers under their breath. A few ladies pressed their gloved hands to their lips. Lucia stepped forward again, her body angled toward the stallion's shoulder. His ears flicked toward her, then flattened in displeasure. She moved slowly, keeping her voice low, not coaxing, not pleading, but speaking as if she had the right to be there. She set her left foot in the stirrup, felt the solid resistance of the leather strap, and pushed herself upward in one swift motion. The world tilted as she swung her leg over. Her skirts caught briefly on the cantle before settling against the warm breadth of Relampago's back. The heat of the animal's body seeped instantly through the thin fabric, and she could feel the ripple of his muscles shifting beneath her seat. The reins were in her hands now, slick and warm from the groom's struggle. Relampago tossed his head violently, the movement jolting her arms and forcing her to tighten her grip. His breathing came fast, hot gusts against the side of her leg. "Let him go," Alejandro ordered. The stable hands hesitated. Then, at a flick of the prince's fingers, they released the bridle. Relampago surged forward like a loosed arrow. The sudden burst of speed wrenched Lucia backward in the saddle, her spine arching instinctively to keep her balance. The wind tore at her hair, loosening strands from beneath her cap. The courtyard blurred around her. Flashes of startled faces, the sweep of embroidered skirts, as the stallion charged straight toward the open gate. The pounding of his hooves reverberated up through her bones, an unbroken rhythm of power. She pulled at the reins, her fingers burning, but Relampago only flung his head higher and drove himself faster. Her legs clamped against the saddle's sides, every muscle taut with the effort of staying seated. The shouts from behind were swallowed by the rush of air in her ears. The gate yawned ahead. Beyond it, the sunlit sweep of open land. For the briefest instant, she considered throwing herself free before they crossed the threshold. But the thought of landing in front of the watching court, crumpled and humiliated, was worse than the risk of what lay beyond. Relampago's stride lengthened. The air shifted cooler as they passed under the shadow of the archway, and then the courtyard was gone, replaced by the vast spread of countryside. Dust rose in curling trails behind them. Olive groves flashed past in shifting shades of green and silver. The animal's every motion was a force that demanded either surrender or mastery, and she could not bring herself to surrender. She adjusted her weight forward, bringing her body closer to his neck. The movement seemed to surprise him. His ears twitched back toward her, and for a heartbeat his stride hitched before resuming its relentless pace. She could feel the pulse of his effort through the saddle, the swell and fall of his breathing growing heavier. The hard-packed road dipped slightly, and they flew over it in a spray of pebbles. A lark startled from the grass, its wings a blur as it darted upward. Lucia kept her eyes ahead, refusing to glance back at the palace now far behind them. Relampago shifted his path toward a break between two low stone walls, the kind that marked the edge of the royal hunting grounds. She tugged lightly on the right rein, attempting to guide him elsewhere, but he ignored the pressure entirely. The reins were alive in her hands, every jerk and pull from his mouth carrying the raw will of an animal that had never been mastered except by the man who had trained him. The wind roared around her, carrying the faint scent of wild thyme from the fields. Her heartbeat pounded in her throat. She could not tell if it was fear or exhilaration that made her limbs tremble. The stone walls opened into a narrow lane that sloped downward toward a distant glint of water. Relampago's pace increased, as though he recognized the path. The ground here was uneven, ridged with old cart tracks, and the jarring rhythm rattled up through her spine. She tightened her knees and steadied her breathing, finding a rhythm with his. Somewhere behind them, far away but distinct, came the faint echo of voices, shouts carried on the wind. The prince's party, perhaps, or the guards. Relampago's ears flicked at the sound, but he did not slow. Ahead, the sunlight flared brighter against something pale, a strip of exposed rock beside the stream. The water shimmered as it ran over stones, breaking into froth where it struck protruding ledges. The stallion did not check his speed. Lucia's stomach tightened as she realized his intention. The stream bed was narrow, but the rocky banks on either side rose sharply, and the ground approaching it was slick with grass. One wrong stride could send them both tumbling into the water. Relampago lowered his head slightly, his stride gathering in power. She braced herself without thinking, her hands tightening on the reins, even as she knew pulling back now would only enrage him. The world seemed to narrow to the pounding of hooves, the flash of sun on water, the dizzying rush of the leap that was about to come. And in the space of a single breath, the reins slid slickly through her fingers. The reins burned across her palms as they slipped away, leaving her clutching only the final inches of leather. Relampago thundered forward unchecked, his body coiling beneath her like a spring drawn to its breaking point. The air rushed past in a blur, whipping strands of hair into her eyes, the sound of the stream growing louder with every heartbeat. She lowered her body closer to his neck, her cheek brushing the hot, damp crest of his mane. The scent of him, sharp, musky, alive, filled her senses. Each surge of his stride jolted through her, a living rhythm that was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. She told herself she could survive this, that she would not be thrown like a rag into the waiting rocks. The water flashed white before them. Relampago's hindquarters dropped, his muscles knotting into a single explosive motion. For an instant, the ground vanished. They soared into air, the rush of the leap stretching seconds into an eternity. Her heart climbed into her throat. The spray from the stream kissed her boots before they struck the far bank. The landing jarred her teeth, the shock snapping up her spine. Relampago's hooves scrabbled on slick stones before finding purchase, and then he lunged forward again, unbroken in his flight. The stream fell away behind them, but Lucia's grip on the reins was ragged, the leather slipping from the sweat on her palms. She worked her fingers one by one into a firmer hold, her thighs tightening against the saddle to steady herself. The countryside opened into rolling fields, pale gold under the unrelenting sun, dotted with gnarled olive trees whose shadows reached like dark fingers across the earth. Every motion of the stallion beneath her was a challenge, not merely to stay mounted, but to shape his direction, to claim even a shred of control. She shifted her weight left, pressing her right knee into his flank. He ignored the cue, tossing his head in a violent refusal. She tried again, firmer this time, speaking to him in low, steady tones between her breaths. The words were meaningless to him, but the sound carried something she hoped he could feel, an insistence that matched his own. Relampago's ears flicked backward briefly, a small acknowledgement before he surged on. The road ahead narrowed, the grass giving way to a beaten path lined with low hedges. She recognized the danger. The space would leave no room to maneuver if he bolted again or if the footing failed. The hedged path bent sharply around a crumbling stone wall, the relic of some old boundary. Without warning, Relampago veered toward it. Lucia leaned into the turn, her muscles screaming with the effort to keep pace with the force of his movement. A cloud of dust rose from the dry ground, stinging her throat and eyes. Her breath came in ragged bursts. The sun had sunk just enough to cast long shadows across the land, the light flickering over her vision as they passed tree after tree. The rhythm of hooves against earth was relentless, the vibrations shivering through her bones. She sensed something change, a subtle heaviness in his stride, the first flicker of fatigue. His breaths came deeper now, the edges rougher, and the foam on his bit had thickened. She seized on it, keeping her body centered, pulling gently, rhythmically on the reins. He resisted at first, tossing his head high, but she persisted, her movements unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. Gradually, his gallop slowed to a pounding canter. The reduced speed loosened the grip of fear enough for her to breathe more evenly. She glanced ahead, searching for open ground, but the path funneled them between two low stone walls that ran nearly parallel, leading toward a dark grove. The air cooled as they entered the shadows of the trees. The scent of pine and earth replaced the dry tang of dust. Relampago's hooves clattered over scattered rocks, the sound ringing sharp in the quiet. Lucia could hear only his breathing and her own, both fast and heavy, weaving together into the stillness. Then came the sound, abrupt, alien in the hush, a sharp, splintering crack. The right-hand wall shuddered and collapsed in a sudden rush of rubble. The noise was enough. Relampago startled violently, leaping sideways with the force of a storm wind. Lucia's right leg slammed into the left wall, sending pain shooting up her thigh, but she gritted her teeth and clung to the reins. The stallion's fear was renewed, burning away the fatigue. He plunged forward, scattering fallen stones in his wake, his eyes wild in the dim light. The walls gave way to a narrow slope that curved sharply into an opening between two massive oaks. Lucia recognized the darkness beyond as the edge of a forest. Its dense canopy turned the light to a greenish gloom, the kind that could hide anything, a refuge or a trap. She had no time to choose. Relampago charged toward it as if drawn by some instinct, the cool air rushing out to meet them like the breath of another world. The trunks loomed high and close-set, the shadows shifting across the path like spilled ink. The ground was uneven, padded with old leaves that muffled the pounding of hooves. The sudden quiet after the clatter of stone was almost eerie, as though they had crossed into a place removed from the sunlit fields behind them. She tried once more to draw him back, tightening the reins with firm, steady hands. This time he gave the smallest response, his pace easing from a headlong rush to a more controlled stride. Lucia let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, but only slightly. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, the sound of another horse echoed faintly. The sound came again, the low, rhythmic pounding of hooves, distant but deliberate, threading through the hush of the forest. Relampago's ears pricked forward, his head lifting as though to catch the direction of the noise. Lucia's heart quickened. She could feel the energy building in him once more, that instinct to outrun anything that pursued. The air beneath the canopy was cooler, fragrant with damp earth and resin. Shafts of sunlight broke through the leaves in thin, trembling beams, illuminating flecks of dust and pollen suspended in the stillness. Lucia kept her hands steady on the reins, her body moving with the stallion's stride, trying to project the calm she did not feel. A low path appeared ahead, hemmed in by two crumbling stone walls, their tops smothered in moss and tangled vine. The space narrowed so much that her knees almost brushed the stones on either side. Relampago hesitated for the barest moment before plunging into the passage, his hooves sending up soft echoes in the confined space. He was tiring again, though not enough to be truly tractable. She could feel the subtle heaviness in his movements, the fraction of a second longer it took for him to gather himself before each stride. Lucia adjusted her weight, pressing her knee gently against his flank, coaxing him toward a slower pace. He responded with grudging reluctance, breaking into a heavy canter that thundered in her bones. A flash of movement ahead caught her attention. The wall to the right sagged inward where the mortar had crumbled, revealing a sliver of open field beyond. Relampago's head turned instinctively toward it, but Lucia guided him onward, unwilling to risk an unexpected leap into unknown ground. They emerged from the narrow run into a wider space. Here the forest floor rose gently toward a crest flanked by tall beeches, their trunks pale and smooth as bone. Beyond the crest, the path twisted into shadow once more. Relampago slowed as they approached, his breathing rasping with effort. Lucia let him have that moment, loosening the reins slightly so he could lower his head. She knew the pursuit was still behind them. The earlier sound of hooves was no trick of the wind. Whether it was the prince himself or his men, they would be gaining with every pause. They crested the rise, and the ground fell away sharply on the other side. Below lay a narrow corridor between two ancient walls, this time with no moss-softened top, but jagged stone edges that would scrape rider and horse alike if they misstepped. The gap twisted in a dangerous curve, the exit obscured by a tangle of branches. Relampago hesitated, his head bobbing slightly, as though weighing the risk. Lucia leaned forward, stroking the side of his neck, feeling the powerful rhythm of his pulse under her palm. "Easy," she murmured, her voice low and certain. With a short snort, he stepped forward, picking his way into the gap. His hooves struck stone in places, skidding slightly before finding purchase. Dust rose in faint clouds with each step, the air smelling faintly of lime and old mortar. Halfway through, a deep crack split the stillness, the sound of stone giving way. Lucia's eyes darted to the left wall just in time to see part of it crumble outward. Shards of rock tumbled into the narrow space, bouncing and clattering at Relampago's legs. The stallion jerked sideways, nearly crushing her knee against the opposite wall. She pulled hard on the reins to steady him, her muscles screaming with the strain of holding him straight in the confined path. His breathing was ragged now, edged with panic. They burst from the gap into an open stretch. Before them lay a long slope downward toward a dense thicket of pines. The ground was uneven, patches of rock and loose soil glinting among the tufts of grass. Relampago's weight shifted forward as he began the descent, his hooves dislodging pebbles that rattled ahead of them. Lucia sat back in the saddle, keeping her body behind the motion, the reins firm but not punishing. She could feel each movement of his shoulders as he picked his way downward, his pace quickening despite her checks. The shadows of the pines crept closer, the air growing darker with each step. The first trees swallowed them into cool dimness. Here the ground was soft with fallen needles, muffling the impact of each stride. The scent of resin deepened, mingling with the faint metallic tang of sweat from both rider and horse. Relampago's ears shifted constantly, flicking toward sounds that Lucia couldn't hear. Then, ahead, the faintest break in the trees appeared, a small clearing washed in muted light. Relief flickered through her chest, but it was short-lived. At the far edge of the clearing, shapes emerged, mounted men, their horses shifting restlessly, the livery on their jackets familiar even from a distance. She drew in a sharp breath. The palace guard. Their formation tightened almost imperceptibly as they spotted her, the gleam of metal catching in the pale light. Behind, from deeper in the forest, came the pounding of more hooves. Faster this time, closer. The sound rolled toward her like distant thunder, carrying with it a weight she recognized in her bones. Prince Alejandro's hunting party had found the trail. Relampago felt the trap as keenly as she did. His head rose, ears swiveling between the threats ahead and behind. The tension running through him was coiled and ready to break, a force that would not be contained much longer. The guards in front urged their horses forward. The sound of pursuit behind grew louder still, branches snapping in their wake. Lucia's breath came fast, each inhale sharp against the tightness in her chest. Relampago's body tensed beneath her, his muscles bunching for an unpredictable choice, forward into the ring of riders, or backward toward the prince's charge. And then he reared, the ground vanishing beneath her, as the saddle lurched beneath her in the heart-stopping upward surge. Relampago's forelegs struck the air, his massive frame lifting high enough for Lucia to glimpse the startled faces of the guards beyond his tossing mane. The muscles beneath her legs bunched like iron, and the sudden lurch of the saddle dragged her weight backward. Her hands clenched the reins, the leather biting into her palms, her knees clamping tight against the stallion's heaving ribs. The world seemed suspended for a heartbeat, the forest clearing holding its breath, the guards frozen mid-motion, the pounding from behind closing the distance. Lucia's heart slammed in her chest, a rhythm as fierce as the stallion's. Then gravity reclaimed them. Hooves crashed onto the forest floor with a bone-shaking impact. Relampago twisted on his hindquarters, his flanks brushing the air inches from the nearest guard's mount. The other horses snorted and backed, their riders cursing under their breath. Lucia felt the stallion's decision before it fully happened, the tense gathering of his frame, the sudden pitch of his weight toward the trees at their right. She leaned into the turn instinctively, her shoulder nearly grazing the muscled arc of his neck. Bark and branches whipped past in a blur as they plunged into the narrow gap between trunks. The air changed instantly, damp, sharp with the smell of crushed pine. Shadows fractured across her vision as sunlight broke in trembling streaks overhead. Behind her, shouts erupted, followed by the crashing sound of riders attempting to force their mounts through the same path. Relampago charged as though the ground itself were urging him on. Lucia guided him with her knees, letting her hands on the reins speak less of command than of shared urgency. He responded in a way that startled her, not with the blind resistance of earlier, but with a raw, focused drive. The ground sloped gently downward, the soil soft under his hooves. They wove between close-standing trunks, dodging low boughs, their path marked by the smell of torn needles. Lucia's thigh muscles burned, but she did not loosen her hold. A sudden break in the trees revealed a gap just wide enough for a single horse, opening onto a downward slope choked with ferns. Relampago lunged toward it without hesitation. The descent was steeper than she expected. Her stomach lifted as they dropped, her back muscles straining to keep balance. Pebbles skittered away under his hooves, the sound mingling with the deep pounding of his stride. The forest thinned. Through the tangle of branches ahead, a muted gleam of light hinted at another open space. Lucia's breath quickened, each inhale sharp with the tang of sap and the faint metallic scent of her own fear. She didn't know if the light meant safety or another trap, but she urged him on all the same. They burst into a narrow glade bordered by tall rocks clothed in moss. The clearing was small, its floor scattered with leaves and patches of bare earth. Relampago slowed only long enough to snort and toss his head, before turning sharply toward another gap on the far side. The new path dropped away steeply, almost immediately. Lucia's eyes widened as she saw the slope, the descent narrowing to a rocky lip, and beyond it, the unmistakable sound of running water. The roar of it swelled in her ears, drowning the noise of pursuit. Relampago's ears pinned back, his stride quickening as if he intended to take the drop without pause. Lucia's pulse leapt. She braced her legs, feeling every taut line of muscle under her, her fingers tightening on the reins in a silent plea for caution. The prince's party was still behind them. She could hear the muffled thunder of hooves, the occasional crash of branches. There was no time to deliberate. Relampago reached the lip, his front hooves skidding on loose stones before he pushed off into space. The leap felt impossibly long. Air rushed against her skin, the scent of river spray cold and clean compared to the forest air. Her breath caught, suspended with them. They landed heavily on the far bank, water exploding around their legs. The impact jolted up her spine, but the stallion kept his footing, climbing the shallow incline with relentless strength. His chest heaved with the effort, steam curling from his flanks into the cool shadows beneath the trees. The forest ahead was different. The pines gave way to sparser growth, patches of sky visible above. Lucia felt the shift in Relampago's pace as he trotted forward, his strides still powerful, but no longer driven by wild panic. Her hands loosened on the reins, not as an act of surrender, but in acknowledgement that his fury had burned into something steadier. A breeze touched her face, carrying the mingled scents of damp earth and sun-warmed leaves. She became aware, almost reluctantly, of the weight of her own body against the saddle, the warmth seeping from the stallion into her. The pounding of his heart beneath her legs had slowed to match her own. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The forest swallowed the path they'd taken, the pursuit no longer visible, though she knew that meant nothing. The prince was not the kind to yield. Relampago's ears flicked forward. He quickened into a canter, weaving through the thinning trees. Light pooled ahead where the forest broke. Lucia's breath caught at the sight of it. The sudden brightness after the gloom was almost blinding. They crossed the final line of trees and emerged into a clearing where the sun lay full and heavy upon the ground. The far side was bounded by a wall of pale stone, its surface weathered and streaked with lichen. It rose far higher than a man's head, unbroken by any gate or opening that she could see. Relampago slowed to a trot, then to a walk, tossing his head with impatience. Lucia's hands tightened on the reins as she studied the barrier, her mind racing through options she did not have time to weigh. And then she heard it again, faint but certain, the distant drum of hooves behind them, drawing nearer through the trees. The wall loomed above her, pale against the deep green of the forest edge, its rough surface streaked with age and weather. It gave no sign of weakness, no breach, no hidden gate within sight. Relampago stood beneath it with ears flicking back and forth, his sides heaving, his nostrils drawing in sharp gulps of air. His tail lashed once, impatient with her stillness, as if to urge her into a decision. The sound of pursuit grew clearer. Hooves drummed against the earth, faint shouts threading between the beats. Lucia's gaze darted along the wall's base until she spotted a sliver of space between the stone and a tangle of undergrowth. It was narrow, almost invisible, but there was enough of a depression in the earth to suggest a way around. She pressed her heel gently into Relampago's side. He obeyed, turning toward the hidden path. Branches scraped along her sleeve, snagging at the fabric, the smell of crushed leaves rising sharply as they moved. The wall followed them like a silent sentinel, its shadow sliding over them with every step. The undergrowth thickened, closing in overhead until the light was dim and greenish. She ducked instinctively beneath a low branch, feeling the brush of pine needles against her cheek. Relampago pushed through without hesitation, his powerful shoulders parting the foliage. And then, at last, the wall broke. A wooden gate stood before them, its heavy planks weathered to a silvery gray, the iron hinges streaked with rust. One side hung slightly ajar, as if time and neglect had worked together to weaken its hold. Lucia's fingers trembled slightly on the reins. She leaned forward and pushed at the gate with her boot. It yielded slowly, the groan of the hinges loud in the hush of the place. The space beyond was shadowed, the air cooler still, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and long unmoved air. They stepped inside. The courtyard within was small, overgrown with weeds pushing between the flagstones. Tufts of grass brushed the tops of her boots where her skirt rode up. In the center stood an old trough, its stone rim cracked, but still holding a pool of water darkened with fallen leaves. Relampago moved toward it without prompting, lowering his head to drink. His deep, rhythmic swallows echoed faintly off the surrounding walls. Lucia slid from the saddle, her legs stiff and aching from the unbroken tension of the ride. Her boots struck the flagstones with a muted thud. For a moment, she let her hand rest on the stallion's damp neck, feeling the steady throb of his pulse beneath the sheen of sweat. His warmth bled into her palm, grounding her after the breathless flight through forest and field. The lodge rose along one side of the courtyard, its roof sagging slightly beneath the weight of years, shutters closed tight against the outside world. No sound came from within. Vines crept up the walls, their leaves trembling faintly in the breeze that slipped through the broken gate. Relampago lifted his head from the water, a thin rivulet dripping from his muzzle. His breathing had eased, his stance relaxed in a way she had not seen since the prince had summoned him in the palace courtyard. Lucia reached up to smooth the damp hair along his jaw, her fingers tracing the fine lines of muscle there. He did not shy away this time, only blinked slowly, his gaze steady and dark. Her own breath came more evenly now, though each inhalation still carried the taste of adrenaline. The sound of pursuit had faded entirely. Whether Alejandro and his men had lost the trail or chosen to abandon it, she could not guess. But in the silence of the courtyard, the absence felt almost fragile. She let the reins slide over her arm and walked to the trough, cupping her hands to scoop water over her face. The chill startled her skin, washing away the thin layer of dust and sweat. Droplets clung to her lashes, cool and clean against the heat in her cheeks. The stallion shifted slightly behind her, his hoof striking the stone with a soft, deliberate sound. She turned back to him, her lips parting as if to speak, though there was no one to hear. For a long moment, they regarded each other, the maid in her plain, travel-stained dress, and the horse who had carried her through danger not of her choosing. In his stillness, she could sense the residue of his earlier fury, a restless spirit that matched her own stubborn refusal to yield. Something had changed between them on that run, a thread of understanding woven through the struggle for mastery. The breeze stirred again, rattling the loose gate against its frame. She glanced toward it, half expecting the sound of approaching riders, but no echo of hooves came, no voice called her name. The courtyard remained as it was, overgrown, still, forgotten. Relampago lowered his head once more to drink, the motion slow and unhurried. Lucia's fingers tightened around the reins, not from fear, but to remind herself that the quiet they had found might not last. The prince, if he truly wished to find them, would not stop here. Yet in that moment, with the lodge walls around them and the air cool against her flushed skin, she let herself believe, just for a breath, that they had slipped beyond his reach. And in the hush that followed, the distant creak of a saddle leather broke the silence. The sound was faint at first, a slow, deliberate groan of leather, the kind that comes when a rider shifts in the saddle. It carried across the courtyard like a whisper of warning, almost lost beneath the rustle of wind through the overgrown weeds. Lucia froze, her hand still resting on Relampago's neck. The stallion's ears turned sharply toward the gate, his nostrils flaring. He exhaled once, a deep, wary sound that sent a ripple of tension through his frame. Lucia followed his gaze. The broken gate stood as it had before, ajar, swaying gently in the breeze, but beyond it, something moved. A shadow, then the gleam of a bridle buckle catching the light. Her breath caught. She stepped closer to Relampago, curling her fingers into his mane. The stallion lifted his head, his muscles coiling, sensing the nearness of another horse. And then the stillness fractured. A single rider emerged through the narrow opening, the hooves of his mount striking softly on the flagstones. The rest of the world fell silent in the presence of that sound. Lucia didn't wait to see the rider's face. Her body moved before her thoughts could form, swinging into the saddle with the ease born of desperation. The leather was still warm from her earlier ride, the scent of the horse's sweat sharp in her lungs. Relampago shifted beneath her, hooves clattering once against the stone before she turned him sharply toward the far end of the courtyard. The lodge walls offered no other visible exit. She guided the stallion along the edges, scanning for any breach, any loose stone that might offer escape. But the high pale wall was unbroken, its surface stubborn against the idea of surrender. Behind her, the rider dismounted. She heard the muffled thud of boots on stone, the scrape of spurs. A voice, too low for her to make out the words, spoke to the horse left standing in the gate. Relampago's hooves shifted restlessly. Lucia leaned forward, pressing her palm against the warmth of his neck, feeling the tremor of restrained energy there. She drew in a slow breath, the air cool and heavy in her chest. The gate creaked again. More than one shadow now moved against the light outside, more riders, their approach quieter than the forest chase but no less deliberate. The faint metallic clink of a weapon shifted in its scabbard. Lucia turned Relampago in a tight circle, the stallion's tail flicking sharply. The sound of approaching steps echoed from the lodge's shaded side, where a covered walkway ran along the wall. Someone was moving there, closing the distance without haste. She guided Relampago backward, his hindquarters brushing against the rough stone. His breathing quickened, ears swiveling between the converging sounds. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of what was closing in around them. One of the riders appeared fully now, stepping into the sunlight of the courtyard. His gaze swept the space in a single practiced motion, before settling on her. His expression didn't change, but the intent in his eyes was clear enough. They had no intention of letting her pass. A shout rang from outside the wall, too far to understand, and was answered by the man in front of her. The tone was clipped, commanding. Relampago reacted to the raised voices with a sideways leap, his forelegs striking sparks from the stone. Lucia bent low over his neck, murmuring something she could barely hear herself. Her grip on the reins tightened, though she knew there was no clear path yet. The air was thick with the smell of horse and dust, the heat from the stallion's body pressing into her legs. Another figure moved through the open gate, the second rider, carrying the quiet watchfulness of someone used to waiting for the right moment. His eyes, too, found her quickly. The courtyard no longer felt like shelter. It was a trap, its walls holding the heat of the sun and the breath of the horses. The exit was too narrow to charge without meeting them head-on, but staying meant waiting for them to close the circle entirely. Relampago shifted again, his head tossing high. She felt the strength of him in every restless step, the same wild power that had carried them here, now surging toward release. Her pulse raced with the certainty that any choice she made would happen in seconds, without time to weigh the risk. From the gate, the second rider reached for the bridle of his own horse, drawing it forward to block the opening entirely. Lucia's breath hitched. Her hands moved without conscious thought, gathering the reins, her body lowering into the saddle in the way that meant motion was imminent. Relampago's ears pinned forward, his gaze fixed on the narrowing space between the two riders. And then he lunged, the power of it pulling her forward into the dangerous, unbroken momentum of his charge. Relampago's sudden thrust forward was like the release of a coiled spring, all the gathered strength exploding in one heartbeat. Lucia's body pitched with him, her chest close to the rise of his neck, her fingers locking around the reins, as his hooves struck the flagstones in a thunderous rhythm. The riders at the gate reacted in a flurry of movement. One man jerked his mount sideways to close the gap, but the stallion's speed was already carrying them into the narrowing space. Lucia heard the scrape of a boot against stone, the startled snort of the blocking horse as Relampago surged past its shoulder. For an instant, leather brushed leather, the edge of a stirrup grazing her own, before they were through. The sunlight outside the wall hit like a physical blow, blinding in its suddenness after the dim courtyard. Relampago's stride lengthened instantly on the open ground, his breathing harsh and deep. The air was filled with the smell of trampled grass and the dry sweetness of sun-baked earth. Shouts erupted behind them, orders, sharp and urgent. Lucia didn't glance back. She leaned forward, urging the stallion on with her knees. He responded with a fresh burst of speed, muscles bunching and releasing under her like the pounding of a drum. The ground beyond the wall sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Stones jutted from the soil like the edges of buried blades. Relampago's hooves sent pebbles skittering in all directions, his weight driving them into the loose dirt. Lucia's jaw tightened. She knew the descent was treacherous at this pace, but there was no slowing now. The sound of pursuit was close enough to feel, the rhythmic pounding of hooves blending with the rush of wind in her ears. She could almost sense the heat of their breath behind her, the tension of riders bent low, closing the distance. Relampago reached the ravine's edge without hesitation, leaping down to a narrow ledge that hugged the slope. Lucia's thighs burned with the effort of holding her seat as the stallion picked his way forward, the path no wider than his own body in places. Her boots brushed the rough stone wall, the scrape jolting her knee. The ledge curved around the bend, and the sound of running water rose up from the shadows below. The air turned cooler, carrying the damp scent of moss and wet rock. Relampago's ears flicked back toward the riders following, then forward toward the unseen river. Lucia pressed her weight slightly to the left, guiding him toward a broader section of the ledge. He obeyed, though his steps were quick, restless. She could feel the tension in him, not the wild defiance of before, but an urgency sharpened by fatigue. Behind, the prince's party was forced to slow. She heard the scrape of their horses' hooves on the narrow rock, the muffled curses of men adjusting to the dangerous footing. It bought her only seconds. The ledge began to narrow again, crumbling in places where water had eaten away the stone. Lucia's breath came fast, her eyes scanning for a path forward, and then the turn revealed it. The ledge ended abruptly in a drop to the riverbank below. The bank was steep, the rocks at its base slick with spray. The water itself was fast-moving, white froth breaking over dark stones as it forced its way through the ravine. Relampago halted for the briefest moment, his front hoof pawing once at the rock. Lucia could feel his decision forming in the way his muscles tightened under her. Her own heartbeat matched the pounding in her ears. From behind, the echo of approaching hooves grew louder again. One of the riders shouted something, the word lost in the wind and water. But the tone carried command. Relampago lunged forward, the world tilting beneath them. The air rushed cold against her face as they plunged down the slope, the impact of each stride jarring through her bones. Pebbles and clumps of dirt broke free, tumbling beside them into the churning water. The final drop to the river was a leap rather than a step. For an instant, they were weightless, the spray of the water reaching for her boots. The stallion landed heavily on the opposite bank, his hooves slipping before finding purchase. Lucia clung to the reins, her breath sharp in her chest. The stallion pushed forward through the shallows, the current striking hard against his legs. Water splashed high against her skirt, cold enough to bite. They climbed the far bank in a burst of strength, the slope softer and more forgiving here. The trees ahead were fewer, the canopy thinner, letting in broad swaths of sunlight that warmed her chilled skin. Relampago slowed to a canter, his breathing still hard but steady. The sounds of pursuit were muted now, the river masking much of it. Lucia let herself exhale, the tightness in her chest loosening by a fraction. She stroked the damp line of his neck, her fingers tracing the ridge of muscle there. He no longer felt like a creature at war with her. Instead, there was a strange, fragile alignment. Not trust, but something that might one day become it. They wove between the last of the trees, and the ground opened into a small rise. From the crest, she could see the land stretching ahead in shades of gold and green, the sun catching on every ripple of grass. For the first time since the palace courtyard, she felt the possibility of choosing where to go. Relampago's ears twitched forward, and his pace eased to a steady trot, as if he too understood they were no longer running blindly. But just as her breathing began to steady, the stallion's head lifted sharply, his nostrils flaring. From somewhere beyond the rise, faint and unmistakable, came the sound of hoofbeats once more. The hoofbeats were faint at first, a tremor beneath the skin of the earth. Lucia felt them in the stallion before she heard them, the prickle that ran along Relampago's hide, the lift of his head as he listened. She drew her body closer to him, one hand smoothing the damp line of his neck. "Easy," she breathed, her mouth close to the warm rise of muscle. "Easy, boy." Relampago's ears flicked forward, and then the sound grew clearer. Distant riders, not yet upon them but near enough to send a pulse through the open land. The air tasted of sun-baked grass and old dust, sharp on the back of her tongue. She firmed her seat and guided him toward the crest, letting him take the rise at a controlled trot. He obeyed with a grudging compliance, his breath sawing in even, heavy draws. They topped the ridge, and the world beyond was cut by a line of pale stone. A wall rose from the fields as if the earth itself had thrust it up, high, weather-streaked, unbroken as far as she could see. No gate presented itself, only the relentless face of stone catching the sun in a cold glare. Relampago halted with a snort that echoed off the barrier, then tossed his head, pawing once at the ground as if insulted by the impasse. "Not that way," she said softly, more to calm herself than to instruct him. The hoofbeats swelled and ebbed, confused by distance and terrain. She couldn't tell from which angle the pursuit would crest upon them. The wall, for all its blankness, offered cover. She nudged him left, into the shadow that ran along its base, and they moved, quiet now, the stallion's hooves sinking into the thatch of dry grass and leaving whispers instead of thunder. Up close, the wall revealed its imperfections, seams in the stones where old mortar had washed thin, vines clawing for purchase in the cracks. Heat radiated from it, the sun having warmed the rock to a low, steady throb. Lucia slipped her fingertips across its roughness as they passed, the scrape grounding, real, a line she could follow. She listened past the drum of her own pulse. The riders, farther perhaps, or diverted. She dared not believe it yet. The ground curved with the wall, guiding them toward a stand of scrub and stunted trees, where the light broke into ragged shards. There, a shallow depression at the base, half swallowed in fern and nettle, leading around a protruding angle of stone. Relampago scented the coolness of shade and stepped into it without prompting, shouldering through branches that brushed her sleeves and left faint scratches on her skin. The smell changed as they moved. Crushed green and damp earth overlaid the dryness of the field, and with it came a hush like held breath. The depression opened onto a narrow side path, scarcely more than 2 unkempt lengths of soil between wall and undergrowth. Lucia kept him tight to the stone, pressing him on with her legs when his stride faltered in the tangle. The wall's line broke suddenly into darkness, a wooden gate, warped by time, one plank cracked through near the bottom. Iron hinges, streaked and scarred with rust, held it sullenly to the stone. Relampago halted, ears pricked to the black line where the gate gaped. Lucia slid a hand along his neck and reached with her boot to nudge the wood. It resisted, then yielded in a slow, low groan that shuddered along the hinge. Cool air spilled out over her ankles, smelling of old shade and stone kept too long from the sun. "Go," she whispered, and pressed him forward. They stepped into a small courtyard, shut from the world by the ring of wall and lodge. Weeds feasted on the cracks between flagstones, Fennel and grass brushed her boots, where her skirt lifted with the motion. Along one side, the lodge stood with its shutters closed tight, the thatch on its roof sagging just enough to suggest long neglect. The place held a stillness so complete it startled her. No birdsong, no voices, only the slow settling of their own arrival. Relampago lowered his head, as if the silence itself were a balm, and moved toward the trough. The stone was cracked along one edge, and the water had grown dark with fallen leaves, but it lay cool and undisturbed. He drank greedily, the lines of his throat working in steady pulls that echoed faintly against the lodge wall. Lucia swung down, legs unsteady with the sudden loss of motion. The flagstones were warm through the thin soles of her boots. She stood and breathed, drawing air into the tight places in her chest where fear had sat like a fist. It would not do to be idle. She set the reins over the stallion's neck and stepped to his shoulder, running her hands down the front of his legs. "Let me see," she murmured, and felt along the tendons, hot but not swollen. A nick above the fetlock with no blood flowing. He flinched once, a small, impatient lift of the hoof, then steadied under her touch. The intimacy of the simple act surprised her. This animal, shockingly alive beneath her for so long, allowed her to take inventory of his strength as if she had earned the right. "You carried me," she said to him, an admission low, and even that felt like a secret spoken to the stones. "I'm in your debt." He blinked, the long lashes casting a shadow over the ridge of his cheekbone, and breathed a deep, quiet breath that warmed her wrist. His scent was everywhere, rich, metallic with sweat, clean in the way of rain on iron. She let it fill her, something to hold on to other than terror and the memory of laughter in the courtyard. Her humiliation, her fury at being made a spectacle, those burned still, but beneath them was something else she couldn't name, a tremor that ran from the stallion's calm into her own bones. The wind shifted and brought with it the faint, muddled echo of hoofbeats. Lucia froze. The sound was indistinct, flattened by distance and the thickness of walls, but it pricked at the tender place where panic lay waiting. She moved to the gate, peering through the inch-wide split where the warped planks did not meet. Sunlight slashed across the narrow path outside. Nothing moved. She held herself there a moment longer, counting the beats of her own heart, and heard only the soft symphony of the courtyard. Water lapping as Relampago lifted his muzzle, the faint stir of weeds in the breeze, her breathing settling to match his. "Not here," she whispered, and shut the gate. The hinge protested, then settled, wood against wood and iron against iron, the sounds clicking into place like a lock she wished were real. She returned to the trough and cupped her hands, scooping water. The shock of cold on her face made her gasp. Droplets chased down her neck, under her collar, a clean line that raised a breathless shiver. She pressed her palms to her cheeks and closed her eyes. If she let the stillness seep into her, perhaps the trembling inside her would ease. It did, a little. Relampago nudged her shoulder with his blunt velvet muzzle. The gesture was firm enough to rock her, unmistakably deliberate. A laugh escaped her, small, incredulous, an ember in the hush. "Are we friends then?" she asked, turning to lay her palm against his face. His skin was warm, the fine hair damp beneath her touch, the muscles shifting like rain-swollen rope when he chewed and swallowed. The chase had made a creature of him, a force she could only ride or die beneath. Here, in this pocket of forgotten stone, he was simply himself, dangerous still, but available to gentleness. She stroked his forehead with slow, even passes. "You're not unforgiving," she said. "Only asked to forgive too much." In the saying, she felt the truth expand. She hadn't forgiven the prince. She didn't know what forgiveness would even look like. She remembered the way his voice had carried. Clumsiness ought to be corrected, and the way he had watched her, the glint in his eyes that had felt like a touch. Rage coiled low and hot, but it braided with something stubbornly alive in her, the refusal to be small in the shape he had chosen for her. He had meant to make her nothing. She had become more. Relampago shifted, setting a hind hoof and letting out a long breath that trembled at the end. She eased the bit in his mouth, slid the damp strap of leather through her fingers, and loosened it a hole. He accepted the change without fuss, lowering his head, as if to say that this, at least, was reasonable. "You see," she told him, "we understand each other." She walked the courtyard's perimeter with him at her shoulder, checking the wall for weaknesses she might have missed. The stone was solid, unsympathetic. The lodge's shuttered windows gave nothing away. The gate, warped but serviceable, would hold if only because those outside would not suspect anything worth finding within. Her mind moved through possibilities, through risks. Stay until his breathing eased. Watch the light. Listen for the pattern of pursuit. There were no better choices to be had. They returned to the trough. She broke the scum of leaves with her fingers and drew up another handful of water, this time for him. He lipped at her palm, the touch of his teeth careful, almost courtly. "Greedy," she teased softly. "But you've earned it." A new quiet unfurled, deeper than the first. A quiet without braced muscles, without the forward-leaning tilt of flight. Lucia stood with him and let it wrap itself around them like shade. The afternoon light lay warmed and lengthening along the wall. A swallow darted across the opening above, a dark stitch in the pale sky. The beat of hooves, if it came at all now, came from some other direction, over some other piece of land she could not see and did not need to answer. For the first time since the prince had spoken her name in the courtyard, she felt unobserved. The thought filled her with an odd, swelling relief, and something else that ached more sweetly, a sense of having crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She touched the stallion's shoulder again, grateful for the honesty of his weight, the clarity of his need, the uncomplicated fact of his breath in the quiet. "We are all right," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Do you hear? We are all right." Relampago flicked an ear, then closed his eyes halfway, his stance widening in the posture of a creature who has chosen, for now, to rest. Lucia stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and let herself draw breath with him, slow, deep, matched. The day continued on the other side of the wall, indifferent and bright, but here the minutes fell like leaves into water, making only the smallest ripples before they vanished. She had not tamed him, not yet. But he had decided she was no longer an enemy, and she had decided that no power would make her small enough to fit inside another person's mockery. Between those two decisions lay a peace that felt as fragile as glass and as necessary as thirst. The courtyard held them without witness, without judgment, and the silence became their first true shelter. The stillness in the courtyard deepened as the sun slid lower, gilding the edges of the lodge and wall in warm light. Lucia stood with Relampago until the ache in her legs eased and her breath found its rhythm again. The stallion's sides rose and fell evenly now, his head lowered, ears flicking lazily at the stray gnats that hovered in the cooling air. She brushed her hand along his neck, feeling the dampness that had dried into a faint salt on his skin. He leaned into her touch almost imperceptibly, and the intimacy of it, unforced, unearned by command, caught her unprepared. She had been on his back through wild gallop and peril, but it was this small yielding that made her throat tighten. The thought of the palace seemed distant, a place belonging to another life, yet she knew they could not stay here forever. She glanced toward the gate. It remained shut, a barrier against the world beyond, though she could not pretend it would hold forever. The absence of pursuit was a mercy, but not a promise. Lucia tightened the girth, adjusting the saddle where it had shifted during their run. Relampago accepted the attention with the regal indifference of a creature born to be served. She checked his legs again, the clean lines of muscle showing no sign of injury. He would carry her wherever she asked, but what she asked next would have to be chosen with care. She set her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. The leather creaked beneath her, warm from the sun. Relampago moved before she signaled, stepping toward the gate as though he had been waiting for this moment. She eased the reins, letting him find the pace, and nudged the wood open with her knee. It swung wider than before, the light outside soft and honeyed with the approach of evening. They left the lodge behind without a sound, rejoining the narrow path between wall and undergrowth. The shadows here were cooler, touched with the scent of pine. Relampago's hooves were quiet on the packed earth, his movement steady. Lucia's eyes scanned the spaces between leaves for any sign of motion. At the curve where the wall fell out of sight, the countryside opened again. Golden fields cut by the silver ribbon of a stream, olive trees standing like sentinels in the distance. It was toward that openness she guided him, resisting the instinct to gallop. The world felt too finely balanced to break with haste. The stream's surface caught the last light, rippling with soft reflections. Relampago stepped into the shallows, the water curling cool around his hooves. Lucia bent low, trailing her fingertips through the surface as they crossed, the cold biting at her skin. The far bank rose gently, and with each step upward, the scent of warm earth replaced the smell of water. From the crest, she saw the first glimpse of the palace far off, the white stone touched with gold in the waning sun. It struck her. How different it looked from here, softened by distance, stripped of its sharp edges. And yet she knew every shadow that lived inside those walls. She let him choose the pace along the path that wound back toward the outer gardens. His gait was fluid now, without the restless defiance of earlier. It felt less like returning to where they had begun, and more like arriving somewhere altered. Though the place was the same, neither she nor the stallion would step into it unchanged. As they approached the wide arch of the courtyard gate, the murmur of voices drifted out. Nobles lingered there still, though fewer than before, their silks dulled in the evening light. A hush fell as Relampago's shadow crossed the threshold, his black coat gleaming against the pale stone. Lucia sat tall in the saddle, her hands steady on the reins. She could feel the weight of their stares, the measure of every glance, but it no longer pressed her down. She had been tested before all of them, and she had not broken. Prince Alejandro stood near the center, no longer in his riding coat, but with the same straight-backed ease, his dark gaze fixed on her approach. There was no mockery in it now, only a sharp, assessing intent that seemed to strip away the crowd and the noise until there was only the space between them. Relampago halted a breath away from him, the evening light pooling around them both. Lucia kept her eyes on the prince, her voice steady as she spoke the first words since she had left the courtyard that morning. "Your stallion," she said, the faintest thread of defiance woven through the calm, "is safe." Alejandro's mouth curved, not into a smile, but something quieter, a shift that spoke of acknowledgement. His gaze dropped briefly to the stallion, then returned to her, as if considering the answer to a question he hadn't yet spoken. The air between them felt taut, strung with something unspoken, as though both knew this moment was not an ending but the start of a different contest entirely. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.